The vastness of space has always fascinated humanity, but nothing compared to the discovery that the crew of the Endurance spaceship was about to make. Led by Captain James Avery, a team of scientists and pilots was on a mission to map the new frontiers of the galaxy. A mysterious signal coming from an unexplored area caught their attention. It was an anomaly that none of the ship's monitoring systems could explain. A point in space, seemingly static, emitted an unknown energy, an unusual radiation that didn't fit into any of the known categories of physics. Captain Avery, eager to unravel the mystery, ordered the ship to approach. "We must proceed with caution. This could be more dangerous than we imagine," said Dr. Ethan Marsh, the team's lead scientist. His eyes were fixed on the control panel screens, where the anomaly began to glow more intensely, as if calling them. The first contact with the rift in space was both fascinating and alarming. As the Endurance drew closer, the sensors began to fail. The readings started to distort, becoming increasingly erratic. Something was manipulating the laws of physics inside it. Captain Avery gave the order for the ship to make a more direct approach. Whatever it was, he knew they were facing something unique, something that could revolutionize science and open doors to the unknown. "We are about to enter completely new territory," the captain said in a firm voice, yet with a hint of apprehension. Soon, what seemed like a small distortion in space revealed itself to be much more. It was not just an anomaly, but a rift in the fabric of the universe. A white hole, a reversal of a black hole, a theory that had been considered impossible until then. Unlike a black hole, which sucks everything in its path, a white hole would push everything outward. An object that defied gravity in an antagonistic way. The scientists on the team were stunned by the discovery. "This can't be real. No one ever thought something like this could exist," said Dr. Emily Lawson, the mission's astrophysicist, her voice trembling with excitement. She was typing furiously on her console, trying to understand what the rift meant. Her mind was racing, processing calculations and theories as the ship's screens filled with data she could barely comprehend. Realizing they were facing a phenomenon that could alter the understanding of the universe, the team quickly gathered to make a decision. Scientific curiosity outweighed fear. They decided to cross the white hole, even though they didn't know what awaited them. They would be the first to explore a rift in space that defied all the laws they knew. With a signal from the captain, the Endurance positioned itself to cross the rift. The ship's lights began to flicker, and a strange hum filled the environment. Something was beginning to happen, something no technology could predict. The Endurance slowly approached the rift in space, like an arrow about to pierce an invisible curtain. The tension was palpable. Each crew member knew they were about to cross into completely unknown territory. Captain Avery, though accustomed to extreme situations, couldn't hide the anxiety he felt. He looked at the screen before him, where the rift in space widened like an opening to an alternate universe. "Prepare to cross," he ordered firmly, feeling the weight of the decision he had made. The ship's engines emitted a low but steady rumble as the navigation systems automatically adjusted trajectory calculations. However, something was wrong. The sensors began displaying increasingly disconnected data. The gravitational field readings began to distort, and the ship seemed to be pulled by an invisible force. The crew held onto their stations as the white hole pulled them in with growing force. "We're being pulled," shouted Chief Engineer Lucas Diaz, his fingers frantically pressing the controls. "The gravitational force is increasing. We won't be able to control the ship for much longer." Captain Avery, his face serious, gave a quick order: adjust the energy flow stabilizers and attempt the smoothest maneuver possible. But it was too late. The ship was pulled into the rift with a speed that seemed to disorient time and space. A blinding flash of light engulfed the Endurance, and for a moment, everyone's senses became scrambled. Vision blurred, sounds became distant, and an intense heat enveloped the cockpit. It was as if they were crossing an invisible barrier that separated them from everything they knew. Suddenly, the flash ceased. The environment around the ship had completely changed. The white, blinding light seemed to emanate from the entire space, creating a sensation of absolute emptiness. The ship was floating in a vast space, where nothing seemed to have shape or definition. There were no stars around, nor visible planets. It was as if they had been transported to a place where time didn't exist, or where it behaved in a completely different way. "We're in another place, but where?" said Emily Lawson, her voice low, as if she feared breaking the heavy silence that enveloped them. Captain Avery looked around, trying to grasp the enormity of what they were facing. "It seems we've crossed into another dimension," he replied, disbelief evident in his tone. "But what we're seeing is impossible." As the team tried to process the situation, the ship's sensors began registering strange radiation patterns, and the atmosphere inside the ship seemed to change. The lights flickered, and a growing hum emerged from somewhere, as if the space around them was alive, reacting to their presence. The feeling of disorientation overtook them all. What was this place? They were facing a new frontier of the cosmos, but what awaited them here, in a space where the laws of physics seemed not to apply? The only certainty was that they were lost in an endless vortex, floating in eternal emptiness, surrounded by a light that offered no answers, only more questions. The silence of space outside the ship was absolute, but inside the Endurance, the tension built up like an almost tangible force. The crew, though still stunned by the sudden change in environment, tried to focus on understanding what had happened. The white hole had taken them somewhere, a strange place, where space and time seemed to behave differently than they knew. However, something was beginning to happen, something that would soon change the course of the mission forever. At first, it was a whisper, almost inaudible, coming from somewhere inside the ship, but distinct enough for every crew member to hear it. "Help me." The voice was fragile, almost a prayer, but the intensity of the message was clear. The sound seemed to float through the air of the cabin, with no apparent origin. The scientists tried to rationalize what they were hearing. "Maybe it's interference in our communication systems," suggested Emily Lawson, but there was uncertainty in her voice. The sound was too clear to be just a technical glitch. Soon, the voice intensified, repeating, "Help me. Know what it is, what I am." The crew exchanged bewildered looks, hands trembling as they tried to trace the origin of the message. There were no signs of external communication, no other transmitter that could generate such distortion. Then, a second voice joined the first, followed by another, all speaking simultaneously but in a strange and disconnected way. "Get out, you can't stay, you shouldn't enter." Captain Avery frowned, listening to the voices but unsure how to react. "It's impossible. This can't be real." He looked at the communication screen but found no sign of another ship or alien presence. The voices continued, now louder, clearer, as if coming from all directions at once. "Help, please, help." Soon, figures began to appear on the ship's screens. Brief images, too quick to be fully captured, but clear enough to cause terror. Human silhouettes, disfigured and without eyes, seemed to float in space, their mouths open in a silent scream. Each face reflected unbearable pain, as if they were trapped in eternal suffering. The images were fragmented, flickering quickly before disappearing, but for a moment, they were there, before the eyes of everyone on the ship. "This isn't possible," said Lucas Diaz, the chief engineer, his voice heavy with fear. Are those people? But they don't have eyes. And they're calling to us." The voices grew louder, all intertwining into a distorted chorus of screams and pleas. Each one seemed to come from a different being, all in desperate agony, but all with a single message. "Stay away. Don't come. You're bringing us back." The crew began to feel watched. the environment around them seemed to pulse in an almost organic way, as if space itself were alive, reacting to the human presence within its domain. The intense light that surrounded them wasn't natural, it didn't seem to emanate from stars, but from some other source, something unknown, perhaps even a presence that shouldn't exist anywhere. "These voices, they're from people, or what's left of them," said Emily, almost unable to believe her own words. "They're trapped here. As if they're in a cycle. A cycle that never ends." Captain Avery stared at the ship's screens, where the eyeless faces appeared again, distorting into quick visions, each one more terrifying than the last. He felt a chill run down his spine, a sense that they were being drawn into something much larger than they could imagine. Something that couldn't be explained by any scientific theory, something beyond the reach of human reason. "Let's go back," he said, his voice grave and tense. "We have to get out of here. Now." But even as he spoke, he knew that whatever this presence was, it was watching them. And perhaps, just perhaps, there was no way out. The decision to return seemed the most logical. Captain Avery immediately ordered the ship to begin the maneuver to leave the white hole, hoping that the journey back would be simple and quick. But something was wrong. As the Endurance began moving toward the rift, a strange sensation overtook the crew, as if the space around them was changing in an unsettling way. "Why aren't we leaving?" said Dr. Ethan Marsh, his hands trembling as he watched the controls. "The calculations are correct. We should be out of here by now." Captain Avery frowned, concerned. He looked at the screens, trying to find something that could explain what was happening, but all he saw was the dull glow of the rift, as if it were stretching around the ship, trapping it in an invisible prison. "Captain, we're being pulled back," said Lucas Diaz, the chief engineer, his voice grim. "The gravitational force is increasing again. We're no longer in control." Tension grew inside the ship, and the lights began to flicker. The strange buzzing sound, which had once been a distant whisper, now became a deafening roar, echoing through the corridors of the Endurance. "This can't be," Captain Avery replied, his voice tense. "This doesn't make sense. We're just trying to return to the entry point. It should be simple." But it wasn't simple. The Endurance was being pulled back toward the center of the rift, as if something invisible was manipulating its course, directing it to a fixed point in space. The feeling of disorientation increased with every second. It was as if the ship was in an endless spiral, being dragged in circles. Suddenly, the space around the ship seemed to distort. What had once seemed like an infinite void now began to take on more definition. The blinding glow that filled the environment disappeared, and a dense darkness enveloped the Endurance. Captain Avery gripped the controls tighter, trying to push the ship away from the force pulling them, but his efforts were futile. The white hole seemed to possess a power greater than anything they had known, a force that defied any attempt at escape. That's when the voices returned. No longer as distant whispers, but as urgent screams, as if they were inside the ship itself. "You can't leave. You can't escape us. You'll return forever." Panic overtook the crew, their hearts racing as the voices grew louder and more intense. The images of the disfigured figures began to appear again on the screens, more visible than before. They were everywhere now, their faces contorted in pain and suffering, their bodies floating aimlessly in space. But something was different. This time, the figures didn't seem as distant. They were closer, so close that it felt like they could leap out of the screen at any moment. "This isn't possible," said Emily Lawson, her voice trembling. "No, is this an illusion?" Captain Avery looked at her, his expression grave. "No, this is real. All of this is real. We're trapped in a place that defies everything we know about the universe." Then, suddenly, time and space began to fold in an insane way. The ship was pulled in a direction that made no sense. Everything around them seemed to transform into a whirlpool of light and darkness, distorting the perception of everything. The feeling of being in an eternal cycle began to form in each crew member's mind. We're returning to the same point," said Dr. Marsh, his voice tense, as he looked at the navigation readings. "It's the same place. We're back to the start." But they weren't just back to the start, they were in a different place, a place that was both familiar and distorted. Every time they tried to escape, they were thrown back, as if space itself were playing with them. The sensation of being in an endless cycle began to haunt the crew members. They weren't just trapped in space, but in time as well. It was as if they had been imprisoned in a version of the universe that was no longer real, but distorted, where the laws of physics didn't apply. The Endurance seemed to be in an eternal loop, with no hope of escape. With every attempt to flee, the ship returned to the same point, but something always seemed to have changed. Something was different with each new return, an invisible presence clinging to the ship. It was as if something was crawling, slowly approaching, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. "We need to get out of here now," shouted Lucas Diaz, panic evident in his tone. But whatever that space was, that white hole, it seemed impossible to escape. It was as if the white hole were feeding off their attempt to escape, keeping them in an eternal cycle of suffering and despair. The Endurance was lost, and with it, everyone aboard. Panic overtook the Endurance. The space around them seemed increasingly distorted, and the feeling of being in an eternal loop consumed every member of the crew. The ship continued to be pulled toward the same point in a vicious cycle, with no possibility of escape. With every attempt to flee, they were thrown back into the center of the rift, and something strange and disturbing followed them, an invisible presence that seemed to crawl into the ship, something that clung to the metal structure and, little by little, began to affect the crew itself. "I can't take it anymore. I can't take it anymore." Emily Lawson screamed, her hands trembling as she tried to adjust the ship's controls. But it was all in vain. The readings were becoming more disconnected, and the ship's systems were failing one by one. The control of the Endurance was deteriorating, and they were being pushed in a direction that seemed to be the same, repeatedly. "Calm down, Emily, we need to think clearly," Captain Avery said, trying to stay calm, but his voice trembled. "If we try one more time, we might find a way out. This is not the end. This is not the end." But he knew they were lying to themselves. The white hole, or whatever that phenomenon was playing with them. The ship seemed to be pulled into an invisible force, a force that made them lose control and threw them back to the starting point with each new attempt to escape. Each time the Endurance returned to the same place, the feeling of being watched grew, and the voices returned, louder, more desperate. "Help me! Please, you need to help!" The voices were no longer whispers, they were distorted screams, calling for help, but no one knew where they came from. They were no longer in the ship's communication system but seemed to resonate directly in each crew member's mind. They seemed to come from within them, as if the ship itself had been impregnated by these lost souls, souls trapped in this inescapable place. But the most terrifying part was yet to come. As the ship returned again to the starting point, something new happened. On the screen, one of the disfigured figures appeared again, but this time, it didn't blink quickly and disappear. No, this time it stayed. It stayed there, staring directly at the crew of the Endurance, with a tortured and desperate expression. It had no eyes, but it seemed to look at each of them with a terrifying intensity. "You can't leave," the figure said, its voice a rough and painful whisper, but one that resonated deeply within each of them. "You are part of this now. Never, never will you leave." The crew froze, speechless. It was as if the words of the figure had some supernatural power, paralyzing them. Time seemed to crawl, the ship now completely submerged in this nightmare. They were trapped not only in an alien space but in a timeless cycle, where every move they made only brought them back to the starting point, to a point of origin where the laws of the universe no longer applied. Captain Avery was the first to react, his eyes fixed on the figure on the screen. "This isn't real. We need to stay focused, we can't let this control us." But he knew he was lying. Something there was beyond his understanding. The white hole wasn't just a rift in space, it was a prison. They were being forced to relive the same nightmare, with no way to escape. Like a cosmic force that not only manipulated space but also time, that place seemed to distort everything around them. We're trapped," said Lucas Diaz, his voice broken by hopelessness. "There's no way out. There's no way back." The disfigured figures continued to appear on the screens, and the feeling of being watched grew with each return to the beginning. The crew felt as if they were being consumed by something greater, something they couldn't understand, but that clung to them with an unrelenting force. Then, something even stranger happened. Suddenly, the space around the ship began to distort again, but not in a logical way. It was as if the dimensions around them were tearing apart, creating new fissures in the fabric of space-time. The blinding white light began to pulse more intensely, and a new presence seemed to manifest, something darker, more threatening. "Captain, look!" Emily screamed, pointing at one of the screens. Something was approaching the Endurance, something dark and ominous, an invisible but tangible presence crawling into the ship. They could feel it getting closer with every second. "What is that? What's happening?" Captain Avery asked, his voice trembling. But he already knew the answer. They were being consumed, absorbed by this eternal cycle, and with every pass through the white hole, something new and more terrifying clung to them. The cycle would never end. They were trapped, not just in space, but in the depths of a reality that made no sense. And worst of all, something was crawling into the Endurance, and there was no way to stop whatever it was. The crawling presence was getting closer. A sound of something dragging, fragile, yet dense and disturbing, echoed through the interior of the Endurance. It was an almost imperceptible sound at first, but as the seconds passed, it became impossible to ignore. Like a growing shadow, something invisible was infiltrating the ship. Nothing seemed physical, but the crew could feel its presence, a growing weight in the air, a chill climbing up each of their spines. "Are you hearing that?" Emily Lawson asked, her voice muffled by the tension. She was in the control cabin, her hands trembling as she adjusted the ship's systems. The sound was everywhere, like a presence permeating the very air of the Endurance. "Yes," said Lucas Diaz, swallowing hard. "I don't know what it is, but it's not natural. It's coming from inside the ship." Captain Avery stared intently at the monitors, but nothing seemed wrong. There were no visible signs of system failures, but the sound, the sensation, could not be ignored. It was as if the ship was being invaded by something untouchable, but it was there, with them. "Captain," said Dr. Ethan Marsh, his voice low and trembling, "it's not possible. It's not a physical sound. It's not anything we can identify. But it's real." The atmosphere on the ship was becoming suffocating. The metal walls, which had once represented safety and refuge, now seemed to be closing in on them, compressing them. The sound intensified, and the space around them seemed to distort once again. The crew was starting to wonder if the white hole hadn't just trapped them physically, but also mentally, creating an endless psychological prison. It was as if their minds were being invaded by the same presence that was crawling through the ship's interior. Suddenly, the lights on the Endurance flickered and went out for a moment. When they came back on, everything seemed even more distorted. The navigation screens began to fail, showing erratic and incomprehensible images. The disfigured figures, with their mouths open and eyeless bodies, began to appear again on the screens, but now they seemed more tangible, as if they were actually approaching, emerging from the digital space and infiltrating the ship's reality. "They're getting closer," Emily whispered, her eyes fixed on the screen. The figures floated slowly in the void, moving toward the Endurance, their expressions of pain and agony becoming more vivid. But there was something else, something that made the figures look even more distorted, as if they were contorting, trying to escape something, or trying to escape themselves. They're trying to warn us," Lucas said, his eyes wide with terror. "They know what's going to happen. They're warning us. We can't trust them." Avery shouted, trying to stay calm, but his face was pale and tense. "We don't know what they are or what they want from us." The crawling sound, which had seemed distant, was now inside the ship. It was as if the presence was materializing in some way, moving between the walls of the Endurance, crossing the corridors, infiltrating the cabins, and entering the minds of the crew. Every breath felt heavier, every movement slower, as if the air around them was becoming thicker, more difficult to breathe. "We need to get out of here. I need to get out." Emily screamed, but her voice was tinged with hopelessness. They couldn't escape. The Endurance was already trapped, and every attempt to flee only led them back to the same point. Every time they moved away, something else clung to them, stronger, more real, more inescapable. "What's happening?" Dr. Marsh screamed, his gaze fixed on the screen. The disfigured figure was now in a completely different position, much closer, its lifeless eyes staring directly at them, as if it was materializing inside the ship itself. Then, a scream tore through the air, not from the screens, but from the very ship itself. The sound was so shrill and deafening that it made all the crew shrink back, their hands pressing to their ears, trying to block the noise, but it was useless. The voices of the disfigured figures, once distorted and incomprehensible, were now clear, with a human tone, a scream of anguish and desperation. "You can't escape. Never again. Never again." Captain Avery looked at the control panel, desperate. He didn't know what to do, he didn't know how to stop this. All he knew was that the presence, the same one that had been crawling through the ship, was now closer than ever, like an invisible shadow watching their every move. It was as if the ship itself had become an extension of that presence, a place where the living and the dead were intertwined, trapped in an eternity with no end. Suddenly, the presence manifested. Not physically, but in the mind of each of them. A deep, crushing weight, as if an invisible force was infiltrating their consciousness, distorting their perceptions of reality. Captain Avery felt an unbearable coldness in his spine, as if he were being dragged into an endless darkness. They're taking us," Emily said, her voice lifeless, as if she were no longer the same person. "We can't leave. We're trapped here forever." The invisible presence had finally dominated them. No longer just the sound or the sensation, but now everything seemed to merge into a nightmare where the Endurance was no longer a ship, but a cosmic prison. There was no escape. They had become part of that eternal cycle. And there was no way out, only the sound of the infinite crawling, drawing nearer and nearer, consuming them. The Endurance was now completely out of control. What once seemed like an exploration ship, a marvel of human engineering, was now a floating corpse in space. The crew was desperate, trying to understand what was happening, trying to find a solution, but the clock no longer worked the same way. Time and space seemed to be shaped by the invisible hands of something far beyond human comprehension. The scream of the invisible presence still echoed in their minds, a sound that infiltrated their thoughts like a serpent, corrupting everything it touched. There was no more reality, only an incessant repetition of the same moments, a cycle that seemed endless. Each of the crew members felt lost, as if they were walking down an endless corridor, where the walls were slowly closing in, and there was nowhere left to escape. "I can't take it anymore. I can't take this anymore," Emily Lawson murmured, her voice empty and distant. She was sitting beside the control panel, her eyes fixed on the void, as if she had already been absorbed by what was consuming them. Fear had turned into apathy, and she seemed like a shadow of herself. "We're all dead," said Lucas Diaz, his voice a mix of exhaustion and resignation. He was lying on the floor of the control room, his eyes wide, but lifeless. "There's no way out. We're trapped here, forever." Captain Avery was standing, watching his trembling hands as he tried to manipulate the ship's controls. But there was nothing more he could do. Everything he touched was useless, a futile attempt to control a machine that now seemed to have a will of its own. There was nothing more to be done, nothing that could stop what was happening. Then, in the midst of the muffled silence of the ship, a sound emerged, a knock, soft at first, but quickly intensifying. It was as if something was trying to enter, something was knocking on the ship's walls, pressing against them. The crew members looked at the monitors, but nothing appeared. Nothing but the void. The sound, however, did not cease. The presence was drawing closer once again, stronger than ever. It's knocking on the ship," Emily exclaimed, standing up quickly. She ran to the control panel, trying to locate the source of the sound, but nothing made sense. The readings were completely wrong. There was nothing on their sensors that could explain what was happening. "This is impossible." "There's nothing out there," Captain Avery said, trying to remain calm. But his voice betrayed the fear he couldn't hide. The knocking continued, stronger now, like a heavy hammer hitting the ship's walls. "Captain!" Lucas screamed, his voice frantic. "Look! It's at the bottom of the ship. It's coming from beneath the Endurance." The ship shook, as if something gigantic was pressing against it. The sound of the knocking was deafening now, and it seemed like the very ship was deforming, being forced to give way under the weight of something incomprehensible. It was as if something was trying to enter, trying to devour them from the inside out. "We need to leave. Now!" Captain Avery shouted, running to the control panel to try recalibrating the systems. But everything was failing. There wasn't enough energy to escape, nor to keep the Endurance functioning. They were completely at the mercy of that place. And then, suddenly, the knocking stopped. Silence fell like a weight on the ship. But this silence was no relief. It was more terrifying than any sound. Something was lurking, something they knew they couldn't see, but felt with a chilling certainty. The presence was there. It was no longer just a sensation, nor a sound. It was something real, something they could feel on their skin, in their minds, in their hearts. The sensation of being watched was everywhere, and they knew they could no longer escape. Suddenly, a figure appeared on the screen. It was no longer one of the disfigured figures that had appeared before. No. This figure was different. It was them. It was a reflection of each crew member, but not the way they were now. It was as if the presence had shaped a distorted and twisted version of each of them, a version that had been corrupted by the very white hole. The eyes were empty, the bodies deformed, as if they were in a state of eternal agony. "No, we're not us anymore," Emily whispered, her eyes wide with horror. But it was too late. The presence had already taken over their minds. There were no more doubts. They were trapped in that cycle, and there was no turning back. "It's taking us," Lucas said, his voice completely devoid of hope. It's taking us forever." Captain Avery tried to scream, but his voice failed. He knew what was coming. There was no salvation. They had become part of that eternal cycle, part of that invisible presence that consumed them, shaped them, and dragged them into the void. They had become a part of the white hole. And when the figure on the screen smiled, a tortured and empty smile, reality dissolved around it. There was no more ship, no more crew. Only the eternal void, the endless cycle, the final scream of a lost soul.